The first rays of dawn crept across the vast Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. 22-year-old Samuel McKenna had always been an early riser, but this morning something felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the old windmill behind their weathered ranch house. Samuel stepped onto the wooden porch, his bare feet meeting the cool planks as he stretched and breathed in the crisp morning air. The McKenna Ranch had been his world for as long as he could remember. 300 acres of rolling grassland that his father Thomas had worked with weathered hands and an iron will for over 30 years. But as Samuel's eyes adjusted to the growing light, something caught his attention that made his blood run cold. There, pressed deep into the dusty earth just beyond the porch steps, were footprints unlike any he'd ever seen. They weren't the familiar boot prints of his father or the ranch hands. These were deeper, more deliberate, with an unusual pattern in the sole that seemed almost military in nature. What struck Samuel most was their size, larger than his father's feet, and the stride between them suggested someone much taller than anyone in their small community of Copper Creek. "Pa?" Samuel called softly toward the house, but received no response. Thomas was likely still asleep, exhausted from yesterday's work, repairing the damaged fence line where rustlers had cut through 2 weeks prior. Samuel crouched down, running his fingers along the edge of one print. The dust was still loose, meaning these had been made recently, probably sometime during the night. A chill ran down his spine as he realized someone had been walking around their property while they slept. The footprints formed a clear trail, leading away from the house, past the old barn, where their 2 remaining horses, Bell and Thunder, stood quietly in their stalls. The mysterious visitor had walked with purpose, each step measured and careful, as if they knew exactly where they were going. Samuel's mind raced with possibilities. Rustlers returning to finish what they'd started? A drifter looking for work or shelter? Or perhaps someone with more sinister intentions? The McKenna Ranch was isolated, the nearest neighbor living 5 miles down a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. The young man stood up, dusting off his hands as he made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't wake his father with what might be nothing more than a curious wanderer's midnight stroll. Thomas had enough worries. The bank payments that grew harder each month, the cattle prices that seemed to drop every season, and the constant threat of losing the land that had been in the McKenna family since Samuel's grandfather had claimed it in 1885. But Samuel couldn't ignore what he'd found either. The responsible thing would be to follow the trail, at least for a short distance, to see where it led and ensure there was no immediate danger to their property or livestock. He quickly returned to the house, pulling on his worn leather boots and grabbing his father's old rifle from above the fireplace. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, not because of its weight, but because of the gravity of what he was about to do. As he stepped back outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the ranch yard. The footprints seemed even more pronounced in the better light, and Samuel noticed something else that made his heart beat faster. There was only one set of tracks. Whoever had visited their ranch had approached on foot, from somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded their property. In this part of Montana, that meant they had traveled for miles without a horse or wagon, through terrain that could be treacherous, even for experienced outdoorsmen. Samuel began to follow the trail, each step taking him further from the safety and familiarity of home. The footprints led past the chicken coop, where their hens were just beginning to stir, and toward the old creek bed that had run dry 3 summers ago during the worst drought anyone could remember. As he walked, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The morning breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, but underneath it there was something else. Something that reminded him of leather and metal, like the smell that clung to his father's clothes after a day of hard work. The trail continued past a section of broken fence that had never been properly repaired, winding through a grove of stunted cottonwood trees that provided the only shade for miles. Samuel paused there, suddenly aware of how far he'd already traveled from the ranch house. Behind him, the familiar buildings looked small and vulnerable against the endless expanse of prairie. Ahead, the footprints continued toward a series of low hills that marked the eastern boundary of their property. Land that Thomas had always told him was too rocky and worthless to bother exploring. Samuel checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded, and pressed forward. The sun was climbing higher now, and he knew his father would be waking soon. If he was going to solve this mystery, he needed to move quickly. As he crested the first small hill, the landscape opened up before him in ways he'd never seen. From this vantage point, he could see for miles in every direction. The railroad tracks that connected Copper Creek to the outside world, the distant smoke from chimneys in town, and something else that made him stop dead in his tracks. There, carved into a cluster of rocks about half a mile ahead, was what appeared to be an old trail marker. Samuel had lived on this land his entire life, but he'd never ventured this far east. His father had always discouraged exploration in this direction, claiming it was dangerous territory where a man could easily get lost or injured. But the footprints led directly toward that marker, as if whoever had made them knew exactly where they were going. Samuel realized he was no longer following a random midnight wanderer. He was following someone who had been to this place before. The thought both terrified and excited him. What secrets had been hidden in plain sight on his own family's land? And why had his father never mentioned the trail marker that was clearly visible from this hill? As Samuel began his descent toward the mysterious destination, he had no way of knowing that each step was taking him closer to a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family, his father, and himself. The morning sun continued its steady climb, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled high above the plains, as if keeping watch over the young man who was about to discover that some footprints lead not just to new places, but to entirely new lives. Samuel's boots crunched softly against the scattered pebbles as he made his way down the hillside toward the mysterious trail marker. The closer he got, the more details emerged from what had initially appeared to be nothing more than weathered rocks. The formation was clearly man-made, carefully stacked stones arranged in a specific pattern that spoke of purpose and planning. Some of the rocks bore carved symbols that were barely visible after years of wind and weather. But Samuel could make out what looked like arrows pointing in different directions and something that might have been numbers or letters. But it was what lay beyond the marker that truly captured his attention. The footprints didn't stop at the stone formation. Instead, they continued past it, following what Samuel now recognized as an old, overgrown trail that wound its way through the rocky terrain. This wasn't a game trail made by deer or elk. The path was too wide, too deliberately cleared, though nature had been working to reclaim it for what must have been years. Samuel paused at the trail marker, running his hands over the carved stones. The workmanship was skilled, not the crude scratchings of passing travelers, but the careful work of someone who intended these markers to last. As he examined them more closely, he found something that made his heart race. Carved deep into the largest stone, almost hidden by lichen and weather stains, were the initials TM, followed by what appeared to be a date, 1923. Thomas McKenna, Samuel whispered to himself, his father's name carved into stone nearly 30 years ago, when Thomas would have been about Samuel's current age. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. What had brought his young father to this remote corner of their property? And why had Thomas never mentioned this place in all the years Samuel had grown up on the ranch? Samuel thought back to the stories his father had told about his early days in Montana. Thomas had always been somewhat vague about his past, mentioning only that he'd come west from Kansas as a young man, seeking opportunity and land. He'd spoken of working various jobs, cattle driving, mining, railroad construction, before settling down to establish the ranch. But standing here, looking at his father's initials carved into stone, Samuel realized how little he actually knew about Thomas McKenna's early life. There had always been gaps in the stories, periods of time his father would gloss over or change the subject when pressed for details. The mysterious footprints continued along the old trail, and Samuel found himself drawn forward despite his growing unease. The path led through a narrow gap between two large rock formations, creating a natural gateway that couldn't be seen from any other angle. It was the perfect hidden passage, the kind of place someone might use if they didn't want to be followed or observed. As he squeezed through the opening, Samuel emerged into a small valley that he never could have imagined existed so close to home. The space was perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by steep rock walls that would make it nearly impossible to find without knowing exactly where to look. But what dominated the hidden valley wasn't its remarkable geography. It was the structure that sat in its center. The remains of what had once been a substantial log cabin stood among a grove of ancient pine trees. The roof had partially collapsed, and the walls showed the damage of decades of weather and neglect, but the foundation was solid, and enough of the structure remained to show that this had once been someone's carefully planned and well-built home. Samuel approached the ruins cautiously, his rifle ready, despite the obvious fact that no one had lived here for years. The footprints he'd been following led directly to what had once been the cabin's front door, then seemed to circle around the structure as if the midnight visitor had been conducting some kind of inspection. Near what remained of the cabin's stone chimney, Samuel discovered something that made him sink to his knees in shock. A small, weathered wooden cross marked what was clearly a grave. The wood was old and grey, but the carving was still legible. Elizabeth McKenna, beloved wife and mother, 1901–1925. Samuel's hands trembled as he read the inscription again and again, unable to process what he was seeing. Elizabeth McKenna, his father's wife, Samuel's mother, whose death in childbirth Thomas had always claimed had occurred in the town of Copper Creek when Samuel was born. But here was her grave, in this hidden valley on their own property, with a death date that suggested she had lived for several years after Samuel's birth. Everything his father had told him about his mother, about her death, about their early life together, had been a lie. Samuel sat back on his heels, trying to make sense of the discovery. If his mother had lived in this hidden cabin, if she had died here in 1925 rather than in 1922, as his father had always claimed, then what else about his family's history was fabricated? He stood up, his legs shaky, and began to explore the ruins more systematically. In what had once been the main room of the cabin, he found the remains of furniture, a heavy wooden table that had weathered the years relatively well, chairs that had collapsed but still showed signs of careful craftsmanship, and in one corner, something that made his breath catch in his throat. A child's toy horse, carved from wood and painted in colors that had faded but not disappeared entirely. Samuel picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The workmanship was excellent, clearly made with love and attention to detail. Had this been his toy? Had he lived in this cabin as a small child with both parents in a life he couldn't remember? As he continued searching through the ruins, Samuel found more evidence of the life that had once flourished in this hidden place. Broken dishes that suggested family meals, the remains of bookshelves that indicated education and refinement, and near the fireplace, a metal box that had somehow survived the years largely intact. With trembling hands, Samuel opened the box. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay, were papers, letters, documents, and what appeared to be a journal written in his father's familiar handwriting. The first letter was addressed to "My dearest Elizabeth" and dated 1920. As Samuel read, a completely different picture of his father emerged. Thomas McKenna hadn't been a simple farmer seeking a new life in Montana. According to the letter, he had been a government agent working undercover to investigate illegal activities along the Canadian border, smuggling operations that involved everything from liquor during Prohibition to stolen cattle and worse. The hidden cabin hadn't been a home chosen for its isolation, but a safe house where Thomas could bring his wife and young son while he conducted dangerous work that put their family at risk. The trail markers Samuel had found weren't casual carvings, but coded messages used to communicate with other agents and contacts. As Samuel read deeper into his father's journal, the truth of his family's story began to emerge. Thomas McKenna had been living a double life for years, using the ranch as his cover while secretly working to break up criminal organizations that operated in the lawless territory along the Montana-Canada border. But something had gone wrong in 1925. The journal entries became terse, urgent, filled with references to compromised operations and immediate danger. The final entry, dated just days before his mother's death, contained a single chilling line. "They know about the cabin. Elizabeth and Samuel must be moved immediately. Pray we're not too late." Samuel closed the journal, his mind reeling. His mother hadn't died in childbirth as he'd always believed. She had died in 1925 when he was 3 years old, and based on what he'd read, her death might not have been from natural causes at all. The mysterious footprints that had led him to this place suddenly took on new significance. Someone else knew about this cabin, about his family's secret history. Someone was still interested in the McKenna family's past, even after all these years. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the hidden valley, Samuel realized he was standing at the center of a mystery that reached back decades and might still pose a danger to his family today. The footprints had brought him here for a reason, but now he faced a terrible choice: return home and confront his father with the lies that had shaped his entire life, or continue following the trail to discover what other secrets were waiting to be uncovered. Behind him, his mother's grave stood as silent testimony to a life he'd never known she'd lived. Ahead, the mysterious footprints continued deeper into the valley, toward whatever truth waited at sunrise. Samuel stood in the ruins of the hidden cabin, his father's journal clutched in his hands, as the full weight of 3 decades of deception settled on his shoulders. The morning sun had climbed high enough to illuminate every corner of the secret valley, revealing details he'd missed in his initial shock at discovering his mother's grave. There were more structures here than just the main cabin. Partially hidden by overgrown vegetation, Samuel could make out the remains of what appeared to be a small barn or stable, and beyond that, what might have been a storehouse. This hadn't been a simple homestead. It had been a compound, carefully planned and strategically positioned for people who needed to disappear at a moment's notice. The footprints he'd been following continued past his mother's grave, leading toward the far end of the valley where the rock walls seemed to come together in another narrow passage. Samuel knew he should return home, confront his father, and demand explanations for the lies that had shaped his entire understanding of his family's history. But something compelled him forward. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had driven him to follow the mysterious trail in the first place, or perhaps it was the growing realization that his father's secrets might still pose a danger to both of them. As he approached the passage at the valley's far end, Samuel noticed something that made him pause. The footprints were no longer alone. Here, pressed into a patch of soft earth near a small spring, were the tracks of at least 2 other people, all wearing the same distinctive boot pattern as the original trail he'd followed from the ranch house. 3 of them, Samuel murmured, his grip tightening on his rifle. And they were here recently. The implications were chilling. This wasn't the work of a single curious wanderer or even a pair of drifters seeking shelter. 3 people, moving together with purpose, had visited this hidden valley within the past day or 2. They had examined the cabin ruins, stood beside his mother's grave, and then continued on to whatever lay beyond the far passage. Samuel's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. Could these be the same people his father had been working against 30 years ago? Criminal organizations didn't simply disappear, they evolved, passed leadership to new generations, held grudges that could span decades. Or perhaps these were government agents, still following cold trails from the Prohibition era, seeking to tie up loose ends from operations that had been classified for security reasons. Samuel realized he had no way of knowing whether the people he was tracking were friend or foe. The passage at the valley's far end was even narrower than the one he'd used to enter, barely wide enough for a single person. As Samuel squeezed through, he found himself thinking about his father's journal entries, particularly the ones that spoke of multiple escape routes and contingency plans. Thomas McKenna had been a man who planned for every possibility, who understood that survival often depended on having alternatives when the obvious paths became too dangerous. This hidden valley wasn't just a safe house, it was part of a larger network, a system designed to keep secrets and protect lives. The passage opened onto a rocky ledge that overlooked a much larger valley, one that Samuel recognized despite seeing it from an entirely new angle. Far below, he could make out the silver ribbon of Copper Creek as it wound its way toward the Missouri River, and beyond that, the scattered buildings of the town that bore the creek's name. But it was what lay directly below the ledge that captured Samuel's attention and filled him with a mixture of awe and terror. Carved into the cliff face, almost invisible unless viewed from this specific angle, was what appeared to be a complex system of caves or tunnels. The openings were partially concealed by overhanging rock formations and carefully placed vegetation, but Samuel could see clear evidence of human modification. Supports that prevented collapse, channels that directed rainwater away from the entrances, and most tellingly, fresh footprints leading to and from several of the openings. Samuel realized he was looking at what might be the most sophisticated hideout he'd ever imagined, a network of tunnels and chambers that could house dozens of people and remain completely hidden from casual observation. If his father had been involved in creating this place, it represented planning and construction efforts that must have taken years to complete. More disturbing was the evidence that the tunnels were still in use. Samuel could see fresh tool marks around several of the tunnel entrances, places where loose rock had been cleared away, and supports had been reinforced with new timber. Someone had been maintaining this facility, keeping it operational for purposes Samuel couldn't begin to guess. The footprints he'd been following led down a narrow, switchbacking trail toward the tunnel complex. Samuel hesitated, knowing that once he descended to that level, he would be committed to whatever confrontation awaited him there. There would be no quick retreat, no easy escape if the people he encountered proved hostile. But as he stood on the ledge, trying to decide on his next move, Samuel heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices, echoing faintly from somewhere within the tunnel system, speaking words he couldn't make out, but in tones that suggested urgency and concern. The voices were getting closer. Samuel quickly sought cover behind a large boulder, positioning himself where he could observe the tunnel entrances without being easily seen. His heart hammered in his chest as he realized he was about to discover who had been leaving those mysterious footprints around his family's ranch. The first figure to emerge from the tunnels was a woman in her 50s, dressed in practical work clothes and moving with the confidence of someone thoroughly familiar with the terrain. She was followed by two men, both younger, both carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. Samuel's breath caught as he recognized something familiar about the woman's profile, something that stirred memories he hadn't known he possessed. As she turned to speak to one of her companions, Samuel saw her face clearly for the first time. She had his father's eyes, the same distinctive green-gray color that Samuel saw in his own reflection every morning. More than that, she had the McKenna jawline, the stubborn set of features that Thomas had always claimed was a family trait passed down through generations. "The old man's getting suspicious," the woman was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Last night's reconnaissance was necessary, but risky. If Thomas realizes we're watching the ranch..." Samuel's world tilted on its axis as the implications hit him. This woman was talking about his father as if she knew him personally, as if she had some legitimate reason to be watching the ranch. And unless Samuel was completely mistaken about the physical resemblance, she might be his family in ways his father had never revealed. "Sarah, we've been careful," one of the men replied. "The boy followed our trail like we hoped he would. If he's anything like his father, he won't give up until he knows the truth." Sarah. The name triggered something deep in Samuel's memory, a half-recalled conversation between his parents that he'd overheard as a very young child. His mother had been crying, and his father had been trying to comfort her about someone named Sarah who had to stay hidden for everyone's safety. Samuel realized he was looking at his aunt, his father's sister, who had supposedly died in an influenza epidemic years before Samuel was born. Another lie, another piece of his family's history that had been carefully constructed to hide the truth. As he watched the three figures examining their surveying equipment and discussing what appeared to be plans for expanding or modifying the tunnel system, Samuel understood that he had stumbled into something far larger than a simple family secret. The McKenna family hadn't left their dangerous past behind when Thomas settled down to become a rancher. They had simply buried it deeper, creating layers of deception and misdirection that had protected them for 3 decades. But now, something was forcing that past back to the surface, and Samuel was caught in the middle of it whether he wanted to be or not. The sun had reached its zenith, casting short shadows and harsh light across the rocky landscape. Samuel knew that soon his father would wake, discover his absence, and likely come looking for him. When that happened, all the carefully maintained secrets would be exposed, and the McKenna family would have to face whatever consequences had been building for 30 years. As he crouched behind the boulder, watching his aunt and her companions prepare for whatever came next, Samuel realized that his decision to follow those mysterious footprints had set in motion events that would change not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone he cared about. The trail had brought him to the edge of truth, and there was no turning back now. The sun had reached its peak and begun its descent toward the western horizon when Samuel finally heard his father's voice echoing across the hidden valley behind him. Thomas McKenna's distinctive call, "Samuel! Samuel, where are you, boy?" carried a note of panic that Samuel had never heard before. From his position behind the boulder, Samuel watched as his Aunt Sarah and her companions quickly gathered their equipment and retreated into the tunnel system. Before disappearing, Sarah turned and looked directly towards Samuel's hiding place, as if she'd known all along exactly where he was. "Tell your father," she called softly, her voice barely audible but clearly directed at Samuel, "that the Denver people are coming. Tell him it's time to finish what we started 30 years ago." Then she was gone, vanishing into the tunnels like a ghost from his father's past. Samuel remained hidden for several more minutes, his mind racing as he tried to process everything he'd learned. Then, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying, he began the journey back toward the hidden valley, where his mother lay buried, and where his father would undoubtedly be searching for him. When Samuel emerged through the narrow passage into the valley where the ruined cabin stood, he found Thomas McKenna kneeling beside Elizabeth's grave, his weathered hands resting on the simple wooden cross. The older man looked up as Samuel approached, and for the first time in his life, Samuel saw his father not as the strong, unshakable rancher who had raised him, but as a man carrying burdens that had aged him beyond his years. "I wondered when you'd find this place," Thomas said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "I've been watching for signs that someone was getting close to the truth. When I saw those footprints this morning, I knew the time for secrets was finally over." Samuel lowered his rifle and sat down across from his father, the journal still clutched in his hands. "Those weren't your footprints around the ranch house, were they?" Thomas shook his head. "Sarah's people. They've been keeping watch, waiting for the right moment to make contact. I suppose they decided you were old enough to know the truth, even if I wasn't ready to tell it." "Sarah," Samuel repeated. "My Aunt Sarah, who you told me died of influenza." Your Aunt Sarah, who's been protecting this family for 3 decades while living a life that doesn't officially exist. Thomas reached out and touched the wooden cross. Just like your mother protected us by agreeing to disappear into this hidden life and by giving her life to keep our secrets safe. Samuel held up the journal. I found this. I read about the government work, about the border operations, but I don't understand how Mother died or why you've lied to me about everything. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far beyond the hidden valley. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years of carefully guarded truth. Your mother didn't die in childbirth, Samuel. She died protecting you, and protecting me, and protecting secrets that could have gotten our entire family killed if they'd fallen into the wrong hands. The older man stood up and began walking toward the ruins of the cabin, gesturing for Samuel to follow. In 1925, I was working undercover to break up a smuggling operation that stretched from the Canadian border all the way to Denver. Guns, liquor, stolen goods, but also something much worse, human trafficking. Women and children being moved against their will, sold into situations I won't describe to my own son. Thomas stopped beside the collapsed wall that had once been the cabin's main room. The operation was run by a man named Victor Castellano, and he had connections to criminal organizations throughout the West. When we finally gathered enough evidence to move against him, Castellano learned that I wasn't just a rancher providing safe passage for legitimate travelers. Samuel felt a chill despite the afternoon heat. He came here, to the cabin. He came here with 6 men, planning to kill your mother and you, to send a message to me and to the other agents working the case. Thomas's voice grew harder. But your mother had been a frontier woman long before she married me. She knew how to handle a rifle, and she knew how to make hard choices when lives were at stake. Thomas walked to the spot where Samuel had found the wooden horse, kneeling down to pick up a piece of carved wood that might have been part of a child's toy. Elizabeth held them off long enough for Sarah and the other agents to arrive. But Castellano had brought dynamite, planning to make sure nothing remained of this place or anyone in it. The explosion, Samuel whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. Your mother pushed you into the root cellar just before the blast. The cellar saved your life, but the falling timbers, Thomas's voice broke. She lived long enough to make me promise that you would grow up believing she died peacefully, that you would never know about the violence that had taken her from us. Samuel sat down heavily on what remained of the cabin's stone foundation. The truth was more terrible and more heroic than any story his father had ever told him. His mother hadn't been a simple farmer's wife who died tragically young. She had been a warrior who gave her life to protect her family and to stop criminals who preyed on the innocent. But why continue the lie? Samuel asked. Why not tell me the truth when I was old enough to understand? Because Victor Castellano was never caught, Thomas replied grimly. He disappeared after the raid on this cabin, but his organization didn't disappear with him. Over the years, Sarah and her people have been tracking his movements, his associates, his attempts to rebuild what we destroyed. Thomas walked to the edge of the valley, looking out toward the distant mountains. 3 months ago, Sarah's contacts in Denver reported that Castellano has finally decided to settle old scores. He's coming back to Montana, and he's bringing enough men and resources to finish what he started 30 years ago. The pieces fell into place in Samuel's mind with terrible clarity. The footprints around our ranch, Sarah checking on us. The message she asked me to give you about Denver people coming. Sarah wanted you to find this place, to learn the truth gradually so the shock wouldn't be too great when the real danger arrived. Thomas turned to face his son. But time has run out. Castellano's advance scouts reached Copper Creek yesterday. The confrontation we've been avoiding for 3 decades is finally here. Samuel stood up, his father's journal still in his hands, and looked around the hidden valley that had been the scene of such tragedy and heroism. What do we do now? Now, Thomas said. "We finish what your mother started. We make sure that Victor Castellano never again has the opportunity to hurt innocent people. And we do it together, as a family, the way we should have done it 30 years ago." As if summoned by his words, Sarah emerged from the passage at the far end of the valley, no longer hiding or sneaking, but walking openly toward them with her two companions behind her. In the late afternoon light, Samuel could see the family resemblance even more clearly, the same determined expression that Thomas wore when facing difficult decisions, the same steady gait that never wavered, even on uncertain ground. "Hello, Thomas," Sarah said as she approached. "Hello, Samuel. I'm sorry we had to meet under these circumstances, but I'm glad to finally meet my nephew properly." Samuel looked between his father and his aunt, understanding that he was standing at the moment when his old life ended and something entirely new began. The hidden valley, his mother's grave, the secret tunnels, and the approaching danger all represented pieces of a legacy he'd never known was his. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah smiled, and for the first time Samuel could see his mother's features in her face, the same strength, the same quiet courage that Thomas had described in his stories of Elizabeth McKenna. "Now," Sarah said, "we go home and prepare to defend it, together." As the sun began to set over the Montana plains, casting long shadows across the hidden valley where so many secrets had been buried and finally unearthed, Samuel McKenna understood that following those mysterious footprints had led him not just to the truth about his past, but to his destiny. The footprints had been a trail marked by family, leading him toward a future where he would finally understand not just who he was, but who he was meant to become. The sunrise that had begun his journey into truth was setting now on his old life, and tomorrow's dawn would bring challenges that would test everything his parents had died to protect. But as he walked beside his father and his aunt toward whatever awaited them, Samuel felt something he'd never experienced before. The complete certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, following in footprints that had been laid down by heroes, ready to create his own trail for future generations to follow. The mystery of the strange footprints had been solved, but the real adventure of Samuel McKenna's life was just beginning.